An introduction to the New Testament. And let's do a quick review of this. All right, this is our course outline. This is where we're going. Part 1, Introduction to the Bible, Introduction to the New Testament in particular, since this is the part we're surveying. And then next week we'll get into the book of Matthew itself. An introduction to the New Testament. Let's talk about the New Testament in terms of politics. What happened? This is a review from last week, real quick, right? What is the political power in the Bible when you come to the book of Matthew? Somebody that was here last week. Romans, right? So you have the Roman Empire. Does anybody know when they took over Palestine? Yeah. Well, they were there before then. They finally did away with Jewish opposition in 70. 63.
80.
Don't mind me, I like to laugh at people. 63 BC, all right. Okay. All right. Now, don't trust anybody in this class. Right? They're liable to make you get centered out. Good popcorn, Vince. When you talk about an introduction to the New Testament, you have to include a certain period of time before the New Testament. I mean, something introduced the New Testament. Yes, this happened actually. Rome took power over Palestine, the world in which Jesus was born, before Jesus was born, right? That makes sense. Jesus was born in the days of Quirinius, the governor of Judea, when the Roman governor was forcing everybody to pay taxes and to register their newborns and all that kind of stuff, right? So what happened in this period of time? And by the way, how long is this period of time? Between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, approximately 400 years. And these 400 years are called the intertestament period. All right? Those of you who took, I'm going to have to redo my diagram here. I hope that doesn't spoil anybody's notes, but it works better this way. Okay? We're talking about politics here. This is a review. And at the end of the Old Testament, which is about what time did Malachi write? Okay, let's say 430 BC. BC stands for before Christ, right? And the New Testament opens with events about what time? When was Jesus born? If BC stands for before Christ and AD stands for what? Anno Domino. Anybody here take Latin in school?
I did.
Yes, what does Anno Domino mean, dear?
That was great.
Big help.
The year of our Lord.
Yes, it means in the year of our Lord. Some people think it means after death, but it doesn't. Okay? So, Christ was born in what year AD? No, I tricked you. Don't trust anybody in this class. He's actually born. Yeah, they say he was born in 4 BC. I never figured that one out. But I think it's because the Romans' early calendar was different from the Romans' later calendar. They adjusted it several hundred years after all this stuff was already set in place. Okay, so we have about 400 years, don't we? Right? This is called the intertestament period. And this is what we're going to be focusing on tonight for the rest of the night. Last week we talked about politics. What was the reigning world empire at the time that the Old Testament ended? Who are the people on the top of the heap? The Persians. All right? It was the Persians that let Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel lead the Jews come back to the land of Palestine from Babylon. I never bought my maps tonight, but I should have. Right? So the Persians were in power. And then after the Persians, it was the... Who won the war with the Persians? The Greeks. Alexander the Great, right? In what year was the turnover? You have to memorize this stuff. Yeah. 331. Yeah. BC. All right. 331 BC. And then the Greeks, what year did Alexander the Great die? No, it was very short. 323, wasn't it? BC. And when Alexander the Great died, then his empire was divided into 4 parts, and which part became dominant? I think it was the Syrians, wasn't it?
I think we went 12 last week.
What did I say last week? I haven't looked.
Egyptians.
Did I?
Persians, Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians.
Should I open my notes?
You were doing it from memory.
I'm trying to do it from memory too. The Persian, Greek, and the Egyptian period. Well, look at that. Thank you. So the Egyptian period. And where do we have the turnover? 198. Then you have the Syrian. This was the time period, by the way, in which that dirty old rotten scoundrel of the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who was predicted in the book of Daniel. Daniel said that there was going to be a king that would rise up from the north, and he would come down and he would defile the temple, and he would force people to worship him as God, and he did that. He came down, and he was really tough on the Jews, right? All of these people were easy on the Jews. This guy was death on the Jews. Antiochus Epiphanes was a very tough period, and he was followed by, yes, the Maccabean independence, right? Things got so bad that the Jews finally revolted against the kings of Syria. And when did this take place? What's the date?
The Maccabean?
Yeah.
165.
Right? 165, and that lasted quite a few years. Until the Romans came. Right? And so this is what happened between the last book in the Bible and the first book in the Bible, politically. Did you ever hear that before? Right? Now, this is kind of important because the reigning power has a lot of influence.
Is there a date in the Syrian in that book?
Yeah, 198 to 165. Right? And the Romans had a tough time ruling Palestine all during the New Testament period. Right? And it wasn't until 70 AD, which, by the way, Jesus prophesied, Jesus predicted in the book of Luke, that just a few short years after his passing off the scene, that the Romans would come, and they would destroy Jerusalem and break down the temple. There wouldn't be a stone standing hardly on top of another stone. He said that's how bad it's going to be. The armies are going to encompass the city, and he warned anybody that was in the city to flee. And there was a 3-year siege of the city of Jerusalem, and when the Romans finally came in, they killed men, women, and children and leveled the place, burnt it to the ground. Right? And that wasn't until 70 AD. This is 63 BC. And so you've got 130 years of Roman rule in Palestine that covers basically the New Testament. And Jesus was born right in here. Right in the middle of it. You've heard of the story, you watched Masada? How many watched that? That's the story of this, right? And they didn't actually win the fortress of Masada, which was Herod's private fortress down in the desert until 73. It's 3 years later, after Jerusalem fell, that they finally, built that big construction up in one. Right, so that's the political thing, and we looked at that last week, and that's about all you have to remember. Before I rub this all off, I just wanted to say that the reason you need to know this Bible background or political background is because the ruling power has a certain effect. It has all kinds of influences on the people over which they rule. And in particular, we're looking at the New Testament, and so we're concerned with the Jews, right? How did these people affect the Jews? I should maybe just put this down. The Syrians, followed by Maccabean independence, and then the Romans. Let's just quickly talk about that, because I don't know if we mentioned this all the way through this last week. What did the Persians do to and for the Jews? They freed them, basically. All right? They allowed them self-government. What did the Greeks do? Yes, look at the Greek language. It was the Greeks that had, prior even to the Persians, for years and years and years, the Greeks were known throughout the ancient civilizations as the people of culture. And other people around the world admired Greek culture. And during this period, there's great trade relations between all the nations, and Greek became the dominant. I mean, it was during this period, this short period of time, that Greek became the dominant trade language, the common language that united everybody. Well, what's the trade language of the modern world? Well, yeah, it has been, and it continues to be. People in China are dying to learn English. I suppose you could say today it's DOS. Right? But anyway, yeah, the Greeks gave us the common language. What did the Egyptians do for the Jews? These people were very tolerant of the Jews, and they encouraged writing. And so it was during the Egyptian rule that the Jews basically became well established in their land. This is the time when the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek, all right, and into other languages. All right. As a result of this, what was that date? 165. What was the end result of the Syrian period on Judaism? We're really oversimplifying this stuff, but you're going to only remember the basic things anyway. Right? What was the end result in terms of the effect on the Jews from the Syrian period? Yeah, what effect did that have on the Jewish people? Yes, it had longer lasting effects than that. Okay, well, the Jews have been monotheistic ever since. Right. It was during this period of time that, because of the opposition, that the fanaticism of the Jews developed. The fanaticism of the Jews. They weren't fanatics when they came back, only in the sense that they were very dedicated, right? The Jews that came back with Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel, they were dedicated people, all right, but the books of Malachi and Haggai and Zechariah, describing what the Jews were like after they had come back, shows many of them very apathetic spiritually, many of them very worldly in their outlook. Right? And something had to cause these people, something had to bring about Pharisees, and zealots and Herodians and, just fanatical type people like you still have them today. Jews are still fanatics for additional reasons today in modern history, but this is what caused them to become extremists, because they realized that unless they stood up to fight and unless they popularized and stuck to the ancient laws that had come down from Moses, that they were going to disappear as a people. What's this? Oh, Maccabean. I can't read my own writing. Maccabean independence. There are other names for each of these periods, but the Maccabean independence. What came out of that? What effect did that have on the Jewish people? Anybody want to venture a guess?
The struggle for independence?
Yeah, that's what it was. Yes, they greatly strengthened the Jews. Hey, this is the first taste of actual self-rule, actual independence, actual freedom. Right? They were given a degree of freedom under the Persians and the Greeks and the Egyptians. But here, I suppose you could say it was freedom. It was like living in El Salvador. That there was a constant fight between different factions of Jews within the country for supremacy. Right? There was a very up and down time, but at the same time, the one thing that characterizes that they had a love, it developed in them a love and a taste for freedom. Everything that was distinctive about a Jew increased in degree during the Maccabean period. Their religious fervor, their cultural, racial identity, it all just heightened during the Maccabean period. Their identity, their love of freedom, their own powers, their ideology, the Judaism, their religion, we're talking about, their religion. It was during this period that for the first time different groups become identified. We're going to talk about this tonight. We'll come back to it. And then under the Romans. What did the Romans do for the Jews? What did the Romans do to the Jews?
Destroy the second temple.
Okay, there were a bunch of negatives they destroyed their temple. But it was under the Romans that another temple was rebuilt. So their worship was restored under the Romans after the temple was destroyed. But the Romans were known for their roads, and the Romans were known for their enforced peace, called the Pax Romana. You ever heard of it? The Pax Romana. Enforced peace. Right? And not only roads and peace, but law. Today, even today, our judicial system harkens back to the Roman days, right? There are good elements to that. Something else. Oh yes, when Romans subjugated a people, they had one characteristic military procedure that they followed. Does anybody know what they did generally when they went into a new country? They beat them up. They tended to kill people. Yes. No.
Did they put someone in rule that would kind of be under them?
Okay, they used puppet rulers that becomes, I mean, that's a significant, I don't think that's very much different than the Persians or anyone else, right? So that's not really significant. But what is significant is that the Romans practiced colonization. That is, when they went into a strong area, this represents Palestine under the Maccabees, they would simply take important people, rich people, and they would simply spread them all over the place. They'd send some to Italy and some to Greece and some to Persia and some to Egypt, and basically that just weakens the country, and they replace them with people that they colonized from another area. So you have Italians in Israel and Jews in Italy, right? It makes for great difficulty in organized common resistance against the overlord. And that, by the way, this was one of the most significant, these things, roads, peace, law, and colonization are the things that prepared the way for the New Testament. So when Christ came, he was able to travel all over Palestine on good roads. You know, and after he died, the book of Acts and the apostles and the great missionary endeavor, they were able to go to the far-flung places in the world on roads. Right? Everybody has heard about that, I think. Common law. What applied in one place in the empire generally applied in other places in the empire. It made it easy. Right? A person who was a Roman could go anywhere. Right? So we're going to talk about this. This is the political background to the New Testament. This is in the intertestamental period. Tonight we're going to develop it a little bit further and look at the religious aspect. I kind of get bogged down in this, I have to admit. But I'd rather get a little bogged down in it and allow you to have a little more detailed notes on it than to skip something important. So, this is B. A was the political developments, and B is the religious developments. In the intertestamental period. Religious. And we're going to basically look at it under three headings. Religious order. Leave yourself half a page for these notes anyway. And religious writings. And religious attitudes. And expectations. This stuff is covered in pages 27 to 85 in Baxter, and I've just kind of summarized it for you. So when this week you're supposed to cover in your reading some of that stuff, and you will find that it would be a good reinforcing for you.
What pages?
Pages 27 to 85 in Baxter. Now, when you talk about order, you're talking about forms and institutions. That's what I'm talking about anyway. Forms and institutions that have to do with the religion of the Jews. And we're looking at how these things were developed in the intertestamental period. In other words, in the 400 years between the Old and New Testaments, you have a lot of new things in the New Testament that you don't have in the Old Testament. Can anybody offer me an example of something that we read of in the New Testament that was not in the Old Testament? All right. There's no mention of synagogue in the Old Testament. What else? Sadducees, Pharisees. Okay, I hadn't covered that, but it's there. There's more. killed Jesus? Sanhedrin? Okay, they come under Sadducees. We could add to this list scribes, although Ezra is mentioned as a scribe, right? But in the New Testament we find the scribes. Obviously there's been a change. All right, scribes and lawyers are synonymous. Okay, you got the idea. So let's just talk a little bit about them in order. Oh, by the way, there's more, such as zealots are mentioned in the New Testament. Herodians, zealots, Herodians. The Essenes are not mentioned in the New Testament, but you need to know a little bit about them. I have a book in my library that claims that Jesus was nothing more than an Essene. That's a common liberal view, that he wasn't the Son of God. He was just a famous Essene leader. What's that? Essene? E-S-S-E-N-E. Now, let's talk about synagogues. Well, the scholars, think that soon after the exile, the Jews during the exile or shortly after the exile, the Jews began to meet together to read the Word of God and to discuss it. The synagogues are not places of worship. Why? Right, there's only one place that the Jews could worship, and that was at the temple and the Holy of Holies, and in the court of the temple. Right? That doesn't mean that they couldn't praise God but we're talking about worship in the sense of offering sacrifices. Anything ceremonial. The synagogues had nothing to do with ceremony. All right? There's no evidence in the Old Testament that there were any regularly meeting groups of Jews that clearly and regularly met for this purpose of reading the Scriptures. Although, and there are a couple of examples that indicate that this may have begun about the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Back in Ezra, we read of a meeting. Ezra 8:15. Somebody want to look up Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 1 and 2? Thanks, Brad. And someone over here, one of these new students, want to read Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 1. Thanks, Vince. In Ezra 8:15 and the following verses, it says that Ezra gathered together 70-odd people to the edge of the river, and they stayed together. They camped out for 3 days. He talked with these men, and Ezra was looking for men that could teach. And it says in verse 17 that they should bring us ministers for the house of our God, and by the good hand of our God upon us they brought us a man of understanding of the sons of Meli, the son of Levi, the son of Israel. And there were 18 men, Sherebiah with his sons and brethren. And then another 20 men. And he names them. And so it indicates that perhaps at the time of Ezra, he was looking for men who could be recognized teachers when they went back to the land to teach the people. Because during the exile, what language did the Jews speak when they went into exile? Yeah, they were known as the Hebrews. And apparently Aramaic is the Babylonian language. All right? And so when they went into exile, they were away from their regular environment. They were around all these foreigners, and they began to lose their own language, just like what happens when Italians come over from the good old country into Canada. They lose their own language, and they begin to speak the language of the country in which they live. And so when the Jews came back, many of them had difficulty with their mother tongue. So this gave rise, this is biblical evidence that there was a need for men to teach and preach. Right? Somebody read Nehemiah 8, verses 1 to 2.
All the people gathered themselves together as one man into the streets that was before the water gate. And they spake unto Ezra and the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded to Israel. And Ezra the priest brought the law before the congregation, both of men and women, all that could hear with understanding, upon the first day of the 17th.
Good. And chapter 9, verse 1.
Now on the 24th day of this month, the children of Israel were assembled with fasting and with sackcloths and earth upon them.
Please read the next verse too.
You also? And the seed of Israel separated themselves from all strangers and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of the fathers.
Yes.
And they stood up in their place and read in the law. They read in the book of the law of the Lord their God 1/4 part of that day, and 1/4 part they confessed to worship the Lord their God.
1/4 part of the day. 3 hours. Right? Quarter of 12 hours is 3 hours. So they stood there for 3 hours while they read the Bible. Right? And so, yeah, especially the chapter 8 reference, there was a wood pulpit, and Ezra stood up and he preached, and they had other guys come and preach, and at the result of that, at the end of that, there was a great revival because the people understood in their own language the meaning of the Hebrew scriptures. And here's the best example, post-exile period, of people that had gathered, assembled themselves, and the scriptures were read. And that's basically what a synagogue was. All right? So when we come to the New Testament, there are synagogues in just about every place that Jews lived. In Galilee, in the little tiny towns. You know, Jesus was from the hick town of Nazareth, up in the hill country, way up north, very far from the center of the life of the religious part of the nation, you know, around Jerusalem where all the sacrifices and worship took place. But there were synagogues in his own hometown, little places. All right, so the synagogue has been said, and I didn't get a quotation, but when I make up notes, I'll definitely get a quotation. The synagogue was said to have been the primary institution that came out of the 400 years, the intertestament period. The primary religious development in the religious life of the nation. Right? During this period of time, they just spread from city to city to city to city. Now, along with the synagogue, developed the scribes. And what is the relationship between the scribes and the synagogue? It's a very natural relationship. It's not hard to figure out. Right. The scribes were the professional experts in interpreting and applying the law and the Old Testament scriptures. The scribes. This is Our second main point on the religious order. The scribes were the professional experts in interpreting and applying the law and the Old Testament scriptures. In Luke 7:30, a scribe is called a lawyer. You can't think of of those words in terms of what a lawyer to us is. A lawyer to us can be a professional expert in interpreting the law. That's basically what they are. But it's not biblical law, it's Canadian Ontario law. All right? Another title for a scribe is a Sopher. Sopher. They're called as a group the Sopherim. 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 And this is the Hebrew title for them. Comes from the verb to explain, to declare. Right? So basically they were declarers of the law. The scribes started with Ezra. About 458 BC, he was a ready scribe. And it's very obvious that Ezra sought out men to do what he was doing. To teach the people, to interpret the law, to translate the scripture. That's a very important thing they did, to translate the scriptures. But in the 400 years between Ezra and Christ, these men degenerated into godless people, by and large, and they did so by the same process that we see happening today. Today in our country, we have liberals. We're talking about preachers, right? Liberal preachers. You have conservative preachers. These are just general words that describe a basic, where a person stands in terms of traditional ideas about any given subject, whether you're talking about philosophy or politics or religion or whatever. So you can have a liberal theologian and a liberal politician and a liberal philosopher. Right? So a conservative preacher is a preacher that believes the traditional things that the Christians have always taught, have always believed. Right? Mary was a virgin, and Christ was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and Christ was God and man, and that the Bible is the Word of God, and there are such things as miracles, and Jesus Christ is returning bodily to the world. These are the fundamentals of the Christian faith, and conservative preachers believe it, and liberals deny it. Every one of those points. They don't believe that Christ is God. They don't believe that he was born of a virgin. They don't believe that the Bible is actually God's Word. They don't believe any of these fundamental things. Well, the same thing developed in the 400 years between Malachi and Christ. You had a shift from conservative belief among the preachers and the teachers, who are the experts in interpreting the Bible, for the same reasons that you had a shift in church history in the first century from the conservative preachers and teachers like Timothy and Titus and Silvanus and Tychicus and Justin Martyr and the guys that were taught by the apostles understudies. The first preachers were conservative Bible expositors of the Word, see? And within 200 years of the New Testament, people began to deny all of these fundamental doctrines. Why? No, it depends on your premises and your presuppositions. What do you assume to be true? What do you believe that bedrock is true? Right? And usually it has to do with the nature of the Word of God. There's a world of difference between believing that the Bible is the Word of God and believing that you can become spiritual by reading the Bible. Now, that's going to shock a lot of people. There's a world of difference between putting your faith in the message of the Bible. I'll put that down. Faith in the message of, and therefore the person of the Bible. There's a world of difference between doing that and putting your faith in keeping the commands of the Bible. You understand the difference between those two? These people are saved because they have faith in Christ. They learned about that from reading the Bible. These people are lost because they are familiar with the Bible. They may be experts in the Bible. They read the Bible. They try to keep the Bible. They try to live by the laws of the Bible, but they miss faith. And the process is still going on today. Right? A lot of people are so religious, and they use the Bible, but they're not saved. And this is what happened in the Old Testament. Very soon, the scribes began to interpret the Bible, and then they got so bogged down with, making sure that they had the exact words when they made copies of the Bible, and they were the experts that everybody came to for answers and so forth, that they lost the essence of it, which was the spirit of the law. They got bogged down with keeping the details of the law, and they lost the spirit of the law. That's why Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5.
It's just going to say, it's how you say that's how we have liberal theologians. How can they call themselves theologians if they don't believe that Christ was born of a virgin or that the Word of God is the Word of God? How do they maintain the name theologian then?
A theologian is anybody that studies doctrines related to the Bible.
But they believe in God and everything. How do they maintain that?
Yeah. The word theologian has a very general and then a very specific definition. All right? So, that's the only way I can answer that. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said in verse... We're going to run out of time here. We're getting bogged down on this one point. Verse 20. I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. When we talk about the scribes and the Pharisees, they had one thing in common. These were the most religious people in the country. The scribes were the biblical experts. They were the theologians of the day. They were the ones that had all the answers. And they were, for the most part, they were lost. Right? Jesus said, you have to have true righteousness. Righteousness that just comes from doing isn't real righteousness. Right? Well, let's move on to Pharisees. The Pharisees were a religious group. That's how, I guess, the best way to define them. They were a religious group that had three characteristics. One, they were ultra-separatistic. Two, they were opposed to politics. And anything worldly. And 3, they were snobs. Snobs and hypocrites. Now, when you read, see, this is why you need to read Baxter, because I'm not covering all the points, and we just don't have the time in this class to get into the detail, but he does. And so when you read him, you'll understand. I'm just trying to give you the highlights, and sometimes you can miss the highlights because you don't understand what's behind it. The Pharisees probably didn't publicly come into existence by name until during the Maccabean period, probably about 135 BC in the Intertestament period. It was only during this period of Jewish independence that they emerged as an outward force. But think of the 3 characteristics. They were separatists. That is, one of the things that characterized one of these guys more than anything else is they would have nothing to do with the world. They'd walk around and they'd wear bells on the bottom of their clothes so that they would jingle when they walked so that people could tell where they were and would get out of their way so they wouldn't accidentally rub shoulders or bump into people, because if they did that, they were defiled. All right? This is no kidding. These people believed that strongly, really strongly, in not having anything to do with sin or the world. That was their philosophy. Now, in practice, they were real hypocrites. And the idea of this stemmed originally even from the end of the Old Testament. Remember, the Jews came back under Ezra and Nehemiah. One of the things they did was that they forced all the people that had married Gentile wives back in Babylon to divorce their wives, to be separate from the nations, because back in the law it says that Jews weren't to marry Gentiles. See? And so this basic concept of separation from the world was something that God did require in the law, and that it was very evident even in the people that came back from the captivity, and that these people just took it to the nth degree. Right? They weren't quite as bad as the Essenes. At least the Pharisees would live with other Jews. Right? They would live in the cities and work in the cities and so forth. You look very puzzled.
What happened to the kids with the Israelites if they were half Jews and considered Jewish?
I don't recall what happened. Yeah. It's always struck me as a very, very difficult thing for the Jews. I don't know what happened. But you can read it in Nehemiah. Okay, it's in Nehemiah, I believe. So this was the basic concern. They were anti-politics because the people that were involved in politics were this group, the Sadducees. They were the aristocrats, the rich people and the influential people, and they were religiously liberal, and they were very lax in their religious beliefs, and the Pharisees had long been opposed to people that were lax in their religious views. There were probably, in the time of Christ, only about 6,000 of them in the country. Josephus tells us. There are probably only 6,000 Pharisees, but their influence, the average person looked up to these people because they embodied the ideals that every Jew, every religious Jew, and they were all religious, that every Jew felt was important, that I'm different and that I'm not a Gentile. The Gentiles are dogs. I'm one of the people of God, one of the apple of his eye. We're special because we're Jews, see? Right. Let's move on to talk about the Sadducees, another part of the religious order. When you're talking about order, the Sadducees are not an official religious group per se. They were simply more like a social clique. C-L-I-Q-U-E, a social clique. Friendly snobs. Friendly with one another, right? They really weren't interested in the average person. They just wanted to keep power. And Baxter points out that during the 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that the priests who were associated with the high priest was the highest priest, right? Everybody got that? Right? That the priesthood became more and more involved in politics. Right? And the rationale is something like this, that even back in the days of, look at Ezra. Right? Ezra was a priest. And he had great authority under the Persians. So he went back and established the priesthood and got things going again, worshiping God and so forth in the temple. Him and Zerubbabel. Ezra wasn't the high priest. It was another guy. What's his name? Jonathan? Was it Jonathan that was the high priest, or Jozadak or somebody? You can read about it in Ezra. And so from the days of the end of the Old Testament, when the Jews came back from the exile, the high priest was generally given a great deal of responsibility by the overlords back in Persia. And this continued on, and this is where guys like Annas and Caiaphas, by the time of the New Testament, these were the high priests. And they had tremendous political clout, and they were Sadducees. And there's a reference that he gives in Acts chapter 5, verse 17 to illustrate this. Acts 5:17. Then the high priest rose up, and listen carefully, and all they that were with him, which is the sect of the Sadducees. The Sadducees, as a group, as a social clique, as the ruling elite, were associated with the high priest. And this is a development that took place between the Testaments. You don't see this in the Old Testament. There's no example of it. The high priest was concerned with worship. They had nothing to do with politics in the Old Testament. But when you come to the New Testament, these guys are right in there with a dirty shirt. Their meeting rooms were in Herod's court. Right? And by the way, one of the ways that the Romans governed and kept tabs on the people in Jerusalem, I read this somewhere else recently, that one of the ways they kept tabs on the people was that they took all the clothes that the high priest had to wear and the priesthood in their priestly duties in the temple, and they stored them in the Roman governor's house in Jerusalem. So all the Roman governor had to do was say, no, you can't have your clothes today. And the guy was out of business. He couldn't go to the temple in his regular clothes. He had to go into the right clothes on, right? And so that's how the Romans, they kept their clothes in the Roman governor's mansion.
So we're all Sadducees priests?
No. There wasn't a necessary connection between them. A person could be a Sadducee, like, for instance, the physicians and members of the Sanhedrin and stuff like that. Right? Okay. So Acts 5:17 is kind of an interesting example. Let's talk about the Essenes real quickly. Baxter calls these the peculiars, the weirdos of Jewish society. They were so ultra-Judaistic that they became almost non-Jewish. Moses was their ultimate authority. Ultra-Judaistic. In other words, they claimed to be the purest of the purest Jews. So we talked about the Sanhedrin. No, we talked about the synagogue, Pharisees, scribes. They believed, like the Pharisees, in separation, but much more than they wouldn't even go into the temple. They wouldn't live with other people. They withdrew to the deserts. They would eat only food that was prepared by another Essene. Right? They would do absolutely nothing on the Sabbath. They wouldn't even cook food. They didn't believe in spitting. And even though they claimed to be ultra Judaistic in a sense, they became non-entities in Jewish life, and so you don't read about them in the New Testament. They're like kind of nobodies. Right? Although it's evident from what you read extra-biblically that people revered them, they had a high regard for them because they were so, so sincere, sort of just like a lot of people view us today. That's right. Jesus was not an Essene, although liberal theologians today, the writings of Hag Amadi or something from Egypt, there was a community of Essenes that lived on an island in the Nile River in Egypt, and their writings have just recently been discovered in the last 20 or 30 years, and they're just now getting them translated. About 20% of them have been translated, and these people, liberal theologians, believe that Christ lived with the Essenes up until he was 30, and then he left, and he went and did his public ministry. That's what they say about that. Okay? But anyway, if Christ was truly an Essene, he would had never have done the things that he did. He would never have touched a leper, of all people. Okay, the Herodians. Who are the Herodians? They were a political group that were committed to furthering the cause of Herod's government. They're mentioned in the New Testament. One example is Matthew 22:16. Would you like to read that verse?
They sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Master, I know that thou art true, and teachest the way of God in the truth. Neither carest thou for any man, and thou regardest not the person of man.
So read the next verse too.
Tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not?
Interesting question. And the question has great significance in terms of who asked it. The Herodians by nature were opposed to Rome. The Herodians by nature were the people that were established. They were willing to support the established rule. They were pro-Roman because they were pro-Herod. You have to understand a little bit. I'm not going to go into it much further, but when Herod was a young man, he had some kind of authority in Palestine. He usurped authority in Palestine. He wasn't even a Jew. He was an Edomite. And then the Jews kicked him out. He fled to Rome, and he made friends with the Caesar in Rome. And he finally, I don't know through bribery or what, he finally got the right from the Roman emperor to come back and to rule Palestine. And so he returned with Roman authority. And the Herodians were people that basically said, let's let well enough alone. It's better to have an Edomite usurper on a Jewish throne that is willing to do things for us as Jews, even though he's not a Jew, and even though he's working for the hated Romans. It's better to have him than just a Roman. That's basically, they were kind of compromisers, political compromisers. And everybody in Palestine was either pro-Herodian or pro. The Jews weren't the kind of people that would ride the fence. They were either pro status quo or they were against Rome. Right? I never realized that until I went through this. Okay? They weren't, the Herodians were simply for Herod, basically. They were pragmatists, very liberal thinking people. They weren't necessarily, they wouldn't get upset about the law or anything like that. Because Herod wasn't. Herod was a godless. Did you know that Herod killed 3 or 4 of his own sons? Just to stay in power. And he killed hundreds and hundreds of Jews to maintain power. He was a very godless man. And he was hated with a vengeance by the Pharisees. All right? Question?
When you know when you're talking about Herod as a man, I guess the first Herod, and Herod as a title. And I take it that word used as a title, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's not always made clear. Right? Sometimes in the book of Acts, for example, we'll talk about Herod, right, as a title, and the footnote will say that because of the time frame that it's talking about, that it's specifically this Herod Agrippa.
The Herod that we're talking about now, is that what initiated?
Yeah, he's the first one. This Herod, yeah. In the time of Christ, I think he was the first one. Okay. All right, now let's go to the Zealots. One of Jesus' disciples was a zealot, Z-E-A-L-O-T. Another name for them, the Aramaic name for the zealots was the Canaanians. An example? Yes. The Canaanians. Matthew 10:4. In listing the disciples, it says Simon the Canaanite, right? And Baxter says that should be translated Canaanian. And then in another place, I think it's Luke 6:15, it calls him Simon Zelotes, right? The Zealots were basically a nationalist Jewish party that is rabidly pro-Jewish, anti-Roman. They were like the terrorists, the Jewish Green Beret. Like the Pharisees, they were fanatic for the law. But unlike the Pharisees, they believed that to bring in the Messiah, you had to do it by fighting. Okay? And they came into being in 63 AD when the Romans crushed the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty. 63 AD is when the Zealots said, they'd be just as happy to stab a Roman as watch him. 63 AD. I'm sorry, BC. I have AD down, but that's not right. Thank you. Though activities are alluded to in Acts chapter 5, verse 37, Acts 5:37 is a reference by Gamaliel. In Paul's day, or rather in the days of the beginning of the church, back to an earlier event. It says, after this man rose up Judas of Galilee in the days of the registration, and drew away many people after him. He also perished, and all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed. And that's a reference to a man who history tells us was a zealot. I think he was the founder of the party, and Gamaliel is going back to that. The original example, he says, look what happened to that guy. You know, if these people are really of God, or if they're not of God, they'll end up the same way. He's alluding to an event that took place in Galilee where the Romans said, we're going to tax you people and take a census, and this guy who was a zealot leader got a big mass of people together and revolted, and the Romans crushed them. Right? And by the way, it's possible that Barabbas, the man that Jesus was traded for, it's possible that he was a zealot, because and perhaps even the two men that died with Jesus on the cross, they could have been zealots, because it was insurrection that they were caught in. So it makes sense. We're talking about something that took place between the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? These people are very religiously oriented. They fervently hope to bring in the Messiah's kingdom, Jewish rule, Jewish sovereignty, but they do it by the sword, right? So the zealots. Before we leave religious order under the Jews, we have to talk about the Sanhedrin. And I'm just going to make a note about rabbi. Maybe there's something special about that too, although I didn't come across anything on it. The Sanhedrin is probably traced back to the Greek period, about 320 BC. It was during this period that the Greek rulers in Egypt favored Jewish self-rule and fostered it, encouraged it. And we know for a fact that by 202 BC, the Syrian king that was in existence because the king of Syria wrote a letter to them that they have found. It was made up of 71 members, which included a high priest, 24 chief priests, and by the way, those 24 chief priests represented all 24 orders of the Jewish priesthood. Remember under Solomon and David that the priesthood was divided into courses? Zechariah was the course of Abijah, it says in the New Testament. John the Baptist's father, right? And so these courses or orders of the priesthood continued down into the New Testament from the Old Testament. So each course of the priesthood was represented, plus 24 elders representing ordinary people, plus 22 scribes. They needed experts when they met. A reference to the Sanhedrin in the New Testament is Mark 14:55. 14:55. They had their own organization. They had a president, a vice president, and then a kakam, a man that they called a kakam. That's the Hebrew word for wise. Chakam. They sat every day except Sabbaths and holidays. This was the high court of the land. I guess I should have told you that. The Sanhedrin was the supreme court of Judaism. They sat every day except holidays and like special feast days, and on Sabbath, which was the day of rest. To operate, they had to have 23 people, a quorum of 23. Quorum. You had to be married to be a member. I wanted to read this just for interest's sake, since we're not going to get done tonight anyway. What page is that? I thought you'd find this interesting. To be on the Sanhedrin, you had to be morally and physically blameless. They were all good-looking guys. Nothing wrong with them. You couldn't have a one-legged Sanhedrist. Right? You had to be perfect health. You had to be middle-aged, tall, good-looking, wealthy. You had to know both law plus different branches of secular science such as medicine, math, astronomy, magic, idolatry, etc. They were well-educated people. He was required to know several languages, so they didn't need to use Gentile interpreters. Old people, Jewish proselytes, that means people that were members of the Jewish religion who were not Jews themselves. Eunuchs were not eligible because they were strange and different. A person couldn't belong if they didn't have children, because they had to be able to sympathize with domestic affairs. They wouldn't let people belong, even if they filled all the other qualifications, who like to play dice or make money by charging interest. They had to have been a judge in their hometown, and then had to have been transferred from there to a small Sanhedrin. So they had to have experience, judicial experience. Right? So that tells you a little bit about the kinds of guys that sent Christ to the cross. You know, they were the cream of the crop of Jewish society. That doesn't mean that they were all godless people, because Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were both believers, right? And we know that they were members of the Sanhedrin. It also explains why they wouldn't necessarily have been there when the Sanhedrin, like all 71 members of the Sanhedrin didn't have to be there when anything was done, when business was being conducted. They had to have 23, right? The job of the Sanhedrin was to regulate the priesthood, to regulate the calendar, they were responsible for the spiritual life of the nation. They were to judge heresy and false prophets. They were to set in judgment on the king's activities. They were to look after the smaller Sanhedrins, etc. Quite a few responsibilities.
They were Jewish? There's something about they were Jewish, but they weren't really Jewish.
think my wife is back under the Essenes. Oh no, they couldn't be a Gentile. They had to be a Jew. Yeah. Right. So that's very illuminating stuff. I don't have time to go into one other thing about the method of operation. It describes how they could operate. For instance, their primary goal when they had a capital offense, a capital case to decide whether a person would be killed or set free on a charge, their primary goal was to try their dead level best to keep from ever sending the person to death. Yeah, and there were real strict rules about how they could operate. You should read that, because they broke all their own laws when they did it, when they crucified Christ. So that's religious order. Let's talk a little bit now about the next key thing under the religious developments of the intertestamental period. All of these things that we've talked about under order were new to the New Testament. They didn't exist in the Old. All of those things. All right? Now we're talking next about religious writings. What were the writings in existence at the end of the Old Testament? The law, which refers to what? All right? The Torah, the 5 books of Moses. That's the first 5 books of the Old Testament is called the Torah, or the law. 5 books. Then what? No, by the end, up until the end of the Old Testament, what were the only writings that the Jews possessed? Religious writings. Okay, the poetry of David and Solomon and Lemuel. All right, and they had some of the prophets were put into this category. People like Daniel, and these were all categorized under the writings. These were called the writings. So the law and the writings. And then the third category, Blair just mentioned, the prophets. In the Hebrew canon, which we're talking, a canon is not the thing you shoot here. It's not spelled the same way. We're talking about something that's spelled this way. One N, canon. That's a word that's used to refer to the books, the sacred books. So when we talk about the Old Testament canon, we're referring to the books that were the sacred writings of the Jews, and they had 22. No, 20. Well, depending on what time of Jewish history you're talking about, 22 or 24, right? And the way they did it is that they put all the, there were 5 major prophets. I'm sorry, there weren't. See, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. There were 3 major prophets in the Jewish Old Testament, and then there was 1 book added on to the end of those. Okay, Daniel was taken out. We have him. We make Daniel one of our 5 major prophets, don't we? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah, Jeremiah. What happened? Lamentations, Ezekiel. I guess we separate Jeremiah from Lamentations and make it one of the major prophets. Right? But they took Lamentations and stuck it on the end of Jeremiah, and they took Daniel out and stuck him in the writings because he wasn't an official prophet. He was a politician, even though he was one of the greatest prophets as far as the ability. Right? He wasn't an official prophet. Right? And then they bumped all the 12 minor prophets into a book called the Prophets. Right? So the prophets, the Jewish prophets, they had 4 books in their prophets. So they had 5 and 4. What does this work? I've forgotten. I'm sorry. But anyway, this is the idea. Okay? They had 3 divisions: law, writings, and prophets. And Jesus himself referred to the Jewish scriptures, the written scriptures that he considered authoritative, as did the Jews. What were the Jewish writings? The only Jewish writings that they had at Christ's time. The law, the prophets, and the writings. Luke 24, 27, and 44, for example. Should read that. Let's all read it. Luke chapter 24. Remember the day he rose from the dead? Jesus met 2 fellows that were leaving Jerusalem. Sad, discouraged disciples on the road to Emmaus. Remember that? So we pick up in the middle of that story. Verse 25. Then Jesus said unto them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. This is Luke 24:26. Ought not Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And then later that night, Jesus met the disciples in a room in Jerusalem in verse 44, and he said unto them, These are the words which I spoke unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses, and in the prophets, and in the Psalms concerning me. Then opened he their understanding that they might understand the Scriptures. Our English word scripture has the word script in it. Do you notice that? What's a script? What's a script? A writing. A manuscript has the same word in it. All right? Script can refer to the letters of a type of cursive alphabet, a type of alphabet. So scripture simply refers to that which is written. The Greek word is grammates, and gramma is the Greek word for word, or no, for language, right? Anyway, I'm just trying to get you to see that the emphasis here is on that which is written. See? We're not talking about oral Jewish law, because that was in existence in Christ's time, but we're talking about the Jewish writings and what was taking place up until the end of the Old Testament. The only writings that the Jews had were Law of Moses, what were known as the prophets, and then which are also known as the writings, or another name for that is the Psalms, because the Psalms were the first book in the group of books that were in this group. It's the largest book, and so sometimes the word Psalms seems to represent the whole group. But this is the 3 groups of sacred writings that Christ accepted as authoritative. Now, during this 400 years between the Old Testament and New Testament, there were some additions. All right? Let me just write some words down here, because because I can't know them all yet. All right, these are the main words, I guess. Weird and wonderful. All right. The Mishnah. This is not a writing, right? So scratch it. It's not a writing. But I want to explain it because it's important, okay? But I just want to point out to you that we're talking about Jewish religious writings in the intertestament period. So the Mishnah came into existence in this period, but it was not a written thing. Neither were the Halakot nor the Haggadot, right? Nor the Midrashim. None of these were written at Christ's time. It was all of this stuff was oral. Well, this is hard for us to comprehend, and I want to say something about this. You realize that the people in Christ's time and in the Old Testament learned differently than we learned. None of you people are memorizing what I say tonight. It would be impossible. And this was one of the great differences between education and the learning process of today as opposed to the first century when the rabbis taught their disciples. What a rabbi did is that he had a very simple message, not too detailed, but it was committed to memory. And he would say it in such a way and illustrate it in such a way and repeat it so many times in front of his hearers that they too would commit word for word what he told them. And this is how our knowledge has come right from the very beginning of the Old Testament. The Jews learned oral material. They memorized the stuff. They memorized the Old Testament. They memorized the laws. They memorized the teachings of Christ. And the early Christians, the early disciples did the same thing. And that's where our New Testament came from too. Oral traditions passed down. And today we are very skeptical about that, because if I tried to quote for you 5 verses, I'd probably make a mistake, right? Same thing if you tried to quote for the rest of us. But that's not the way it was in those days. They did it all the time. That's the way they learned. They didn't have industries to produce paper and bit pens. You know, the only thing they had to write on was papyrus, reeds, and skins of animals, and they were both in short supply. You know, so it wasn't common for people to write stuff down. In fact, it was frowned upon in the Old Testament for Jews to write down anything, any of these oral traditions. The only people that were allowed to write these things down were some of the scribes themselves, because they were the professionals. They were the only ones that would be allowed to do this. An ordinary Jew couldn't. See? So you have to understand that. Now, the reason we're going to discuss these points under religious developments, under writings, is because the only Jewish sacred writings that actually existed was the Old Testament. That's the only thing that actually was written. But this stuff here was just as real to the Jew of the New Testament as that. In fact, it was more real. Basically, the authority for the average Jew, the scribe and the Pharisee and all those people, the zealots, the authority of the average person was this instead of this. The authority was not the sacred writings, but the oral traditions.
So in the synagogue, they would recite.
They would read this and teach this.
And so those teachings were based on the Old Testament writings, or
Originally they were, right? But there was a process. Let me show you the process.